So let me read a little bit from that section. Uh, an oft stated aim for Maududi was to free Muslims from colonial intellectual slavery or Zaini Gholami. To do this, he brought together different traditions of thought, a cosmopolitanism that was not unique to him and is an underappreciated hallmark of much political thought from the global south, particularly of Islamic thought. In the South Asian context, the influence of Partha Chatterjee's thoughtful argument regarding derivative discourses of Indian anti colonial nationalism has led to obscure the creativity with which these thinkers and activists approach the question of imagining different futures. Um, However, there is a significant variation in how deeply different anti colonial ideas were anchored in Enlightenment universals. In any case, there is a clear case for moving beyond diffusionist histories of political ideas. Maududi went further than many contemporary anti colonial thinkers by questioning the colonial hierarchy of knowledge that placed European political ideas and normative values at the apex, and he sought to do so through his reading of the Islamic tradition. In so doing, he raised important questions for ongoing conversations about the legacies of colonialism in knowledge production and their implications for political practice and norms of governance. Even if his answers were not persuasive to all, including many Muslims, the questions he raised about the possibility of imagining modernity beyond European experiences were prescient and generative. Now, much scholarship has tended to place Maududi's ideas primarily within the Islamic or South Asian context. This is important and valuable. Maududi operated in the highly complex, vibrant, and diverse South Asian political and intellectual context. His early appreciation, as well as later contestation of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's ideas and political decisions, manifests itself in his attempt at inverting the colonial matrix of knowledge and values. Like Gandhi, tempered with a sharp focus on the Islamic tradition in opposition to or in difference to Gandhi's emphasis on the Vedic one. Both Maududi and Gandhi are actually making similar kinds of moves in trying to go to what they think of as a vernacular tradition. For Gandhi, this is actually a slightly more, a less organic move because he has to educate himself in the Vedic tradition, whereas Maududi is a bit more steeped in his learning, although he's not trained as an alim, but he's nevertheless much more steeped in Islamic history and juridical debates. Now, Gandhi, however, developed his suspicion of the state and democracy in a more robust manner than Maududi. Maududi also sought to carve out a space between Muslim nationalists such as Jinnah, who wanted a separate nation state for Muslims, and nationalist Muslims who wanted an Indian nation state. Maududi opposed both and rejected the idea of a nation state. However, despite vehement opposition of Muhammad Ali Jinnah's demand for a separate country for Muslims, Maududi chose to move to Pakistan when India was divided. In Pakistan, he formed alliances with a range of political parties, including the communists in the early 1950s, to combat the monopolistic hold of the Muslim League. And in fact, it is interesting that the first anti-Muslim League meeting or public meeting that was held in West Pakistan at that time, today's Pakistan, was actually co-organized by the Communist Party and Jamaat-e-Islami. In Pakistan, and so as I was saying, he had this history of some alliance or at least some working together with the communists in the early 50s. But through the 1960s, his party's increasingly violent competition with leftist groups on college campuses, and then from the 1970s onwards, the co-option with by Zia's regime indicates the tensions in his approach. In a similar vein, his decision to hold in abeyance a previously expressed opposition to women as leaders of an ideal Islamic state to support Fatma Jinnah in the presidential election against the military dictator Ayub Khan gives some indication of the hierarchy of his commitments, because he chose at that point, he said explicitly that actually this is not an ideal Islamic state that we're operating in right now. Right now, we are in a situation of dictatorship. And even though in principle I am opposed to the leadership of women in an ideal Islamic state, at this point, it is important that we support Fatma Jinnah, because at this point we are confronting a military dictatorship. Embedding Maududi's arguments within wider Islamic debates also allows us much insight. So, I'm not saying that that it's not important that we place him within the Islamic context. And in fact, it's interesting to note that while he referred primarily to the early days of Islam, focusing on the life of the Prophet and his companions, Maududi was well versed in modern and more regional history, having published two books specifically on the history of the Deccan during his time in Hyderabad. So the books were called Deccan Ki Siyasi Tarikh. This was published in 1931, and Daulat-e Asfiya or Hukumat-e Birtaniya in 1928. The influence of philosophical questions raised by Muhammad Iqbal, the poet and philosopher, on Maududi's thought, even as the two propose different answers, is also an important element of this context and contribution. Maududi's thought belies a modernist architecture with an interest in ironing out contradictions and rationalizing inconsistencies, but his deep investment in a strand of Sufism pushed against these constraints of modernist visions of religiosity. Um, and so we can place him within a wider Islamic intellectual lineage, and at a relatively early age, he actually also translated the Egyptian modernist Qasim Amin's book, which was an argument against the veiling of women. It was called The Liberation of Women, published in 1899. Maududi translated that from Arabic into Urdu. But it's also important that, it's that we acknowledge the Pan-Asian and European debates that he also engaged with. These added to both the structure and substance of his ideas. Given the later acrimonious competition between his party, the Jamaat-e-Islami, and leftist groups in Pakistan in the 1960s and 70s, a surprising and relatively understudied source of inspiration for Maududi and for viewing for Maududi was the Bolshevik government in Russia. The Bolsheviks supported various regional movements that used Islamic ideas and practices as expressions of anti-Tsarism and anti-colonialism from 1917 until the mid-1920s. Muslims constituted about 10% of the Russian Empire at the time of the revolution, and the Bolsheviks needed their support in particular regions. The support for anti-colonialism more generally also formed part of Lenin's pivot away from Europe to the colonized world in the 1920s. The coming together of communist support for sub-national anti-imperial groups and the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire created intellectual ripples in direct as well as subtle and non-linear ways. As an example of the more circuitous intellectual influences, consider the paradox that despite the association of communism with atheism, many of the first Muslim communists in India were deeply religious men who left British India, declaring it Darul Harb, or land of war against Islam, as a result of British complicity in dismantling the Ottoman Empire. These migrants decided to move to Afghanistan to be able to live their lives in accordance with Islamic principles. However, the Afghan government soon became suspicious, and especially with the large numbers coming through, they were concerned about their influence on domestic politics, and the Afghan government tried to kind of either push them out or push them back, which led some to return and some to move to Tashkent. Welcomed by the Soviet Union, some of the migrants enrolled in the University of Eastern Toilers and went on to become prominent Indian communist leaders. Maududi was involved in the earlier stages of the movement, called the Hijrat movement, but moved away from it after disputes with its leadership because of his insistence that the strategies and goals be planned and realistic. So Maududi never undertook that migration himself. but he was involved with some of the debates within the movement, some of its leaders at an earlier stage, and all of this also ideally, hopefully, gives you a sense of the ways in which many different futures were being imagined. This was a period of much intellectual debate, openness, and Maududi is actually engaged with many of these currents. Pan-Asian anti-colonialism also brought together Marxists, pan-Islamists, liberal nationalists, and socialists in interesting conversations. Maududi is known to have attended meetings organized by the socialist Khairi brothers in Delhi, who had, in their appearance before the Central Committee of the Soviets in Russia in 1918, proclaimed that the time had come for India to free herself following what had been done in Russia. Maududi incorporated questions raised by communists about the place of imperialism and capitalism and assumptions regarding the role of the state in modern politics, as well as communist organizational practices, into his project of thinking through alternatives to European modernity from the Islamic tradition. This led to generative tensions, from his insistence on organizing the Jamaat-e-Islami as a cadre-based Leninist party, right? So the structure of the Jamaat-e-Islami is very similar to a Leninist party. There is one becomes a Hami, then to become a member takes a long time. Then to become a member of the Shura or the Politburo takes even longer. At all stages people are vetted. They spend a lot of time, engaging in activism for the party. So the structure is a Leninist party's structure. But at the same time, he emphasized the importance of this party being led by men steeped in pious humility regarding divine sovereignty. So there's a tension also between his commitment to establishing the rationality of Islam, even as he rejected European definitions of religion as reductive, and his rhetoric of revolutionary takeover of the state, even as he realized and remained suspicious of the state as well. So Maududi does say that the one institution that really challenges Deen in the contemporary context is the state, right? So he both is enthused by it, but he's also really worried by it. Maududi's direct engagement with Marx's writings seemed limited. He did, however, read at least some of Marx's work, although it is not clear what exactly. And in 1939, he wrote an essay evaluating the philosophical approach of Hegel and Marx. While admitting that there was much to appreciate in their thought, and they elaborated one aspect, juz, of reality, Maududi was skeptical about their understanding of the world beyond Europe. He had two major critiques. The first related to the lack of human agency in the thought of Hegel and Marx. He thought that Hegel in particular presented the idea that human being has no independent consciousness, control, and will. And this was not something he thought an Islamic view of the self could condone. Moreover, he found Hegel's view of history to rest upon speculation rather than historical detail. Instead of a detailed analysis of the process through which the dialectical process, or jadali amal in Urdu, takes place, Hegel, he said, looks at it as a bird flying in the air looks over the whole city. Marx, he thought, intensified the lack of individual autonomy, khud ikhtiyari in Urdu, that Hegel proposed by relying heavily on the idea of material reality, reducing human beings to biological rather than spiritual beings. Now, like Marx, Maududi also saw human history as manifesting a profound struggle. But in contrast to Marx, for him, this struggle was between the different aspects of human nature, the base element and the spiritual self. So this, of course, there's a long history of this thinking in the wider Islamic tradition as well, that we all have different elements within ourselves. And for Maududi, the struggle was really about between these different elements of a human nature. Drawing upon the long-standing idea that Islam presents the most natural vision of human life, Maududi thought that the Islamic tradition had already recognized both sides of human nature and catered for them by recognizing that while each individual was responsible for the struggle of his own or her own nafs, society could be so structured as to support this goal. Let me actually, in the interest of time, stop around here because what I wanted to do was to give you a flavor of the different kinds of influences that Maududi brought together and that I've highlighted in the introduction to this book. Oh, I see Mizan. Hi, Mizan. Very nice to see you. So let me stop at this point and maybe take some questions, given that we are short of time. But the idea was to give you some of the interlocutors that I think he has and he takes seriously that we often don't think of when we discuss or when we think with Maududi's ideas. So
Thank
thank you.
you. Thank you very much. Right now, we will go to the Q&A session. So if you have any question to our respected um, professor, please raise your hand and open your audio and you can question our speaker.
Yeah, it would be also very nice actually if I can see people, if people can switch on their cameras as well. It is, I know it's nighttime in Bangladesh and many are probably ready to sleep, but anyway, it's nice to see people rather than just hear their voices.
I beg to differ because it's now season of World Cup, so almost everyone is readying themselves to watch some football. So I
Right,
don't
and
think
stay
so.
awake the whole night.
I think maybe I should ask us. Okay, Mizanur Rahman, please. Mizanur Rahman, please.
Good to see you, Humeira, here, and
Yeah.
thank you for taking time to speak for dark audiences. And congratulations for the book. I'm yet to read it. So I had like two questions. The first question is
Mm-hmm.
about your like approaches to Maududi.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that I didn't read it. So from your uh, speech today, I see that you have seen Maududi from anti-colonial perspective, but not entirely anti-colonial perspective. So traditionally, we read Maududi as an Islamist, as an modern thinker, or many other
Mm-hmm.
ways. So
Mm-hmm.
what adds to your book when you read it as an anti-colonial, not
Mm-hmm.
other ways?
Mm-hmm.
The second question is so we also see that like Jamaat Islami, Maududi, and you also like are kind of alluded about it, is that are seen as a like kind of like Maududi kind of followed a kind of Leninist party structure. And
Mm-hmm.
the popular argument is that he just followed it and gave a name Islamic, nothing innovative here. So I was thinking like, what do you think about that kind of argument? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Um, Thank you very much, Mizan, and very nice to see you. It must be also similarly very early or very late for you right now. Um, so thank you for both these questions. The first question is a very important one for us to think through. What changes, what adds to our understanding of both anti-colonial thought and Maududi if we read him as an anti-colonial thinker? I think the first thing to say is that, part of the reason why one is able to do that is because Maududi is very explicit about his contestation of colonialism. So he says very, very clearly that he is against colonialism. He says it often in his work. He says it very explicitly that what he's also concerned about, and in the quote that I wrote that I read out earlier on in this talk, is that he's also very concerned about the epistemological implications of colonialism. The fact that there is a way of that each way of life has also its own way of knowing things. And the idea that one can move away from that and yet stay with a particular way of life is to him not possible. So he's really concerned about the fact that there's a that ways of knowledge or ways of thinking will be obscured through this kind of colonial project and process, and then that will mean that there will be no alternative ways of being left as well. So when we read him as an anti-colonial thinker, I think some of his ideas make better sense. They make better sense for us to be able to connect some of the positions that he took over the course of his political career. And also it makes more sense to kind of think about the ways in which he's using certain terms, the ways in which he's trying to think of an alternative political structure that uses some parts of what colonial administrators have brought in or are being practiced in Europe and America, but not everything. So there is a contestation of Enlightenment ideals as well as ideas, and that stems, I think, from that anti-colonialism. So this is the value, or at least some of the value, I think, that comes from reading him as an anti-colonial thinker. And so, on the other hand, actually including Maududi into our understanding of anti colonialism also opens up useful ways of thinking about anti colonialism. Sometimes anti colonialism is understood as a very kind of, and I think it's a mistake to think about anti colonialism as a particular version of perhaps a liberal left position, right? There were many anti-colonials who were much more politically radical in various ways than that liberal left position. Many were not looking for a nation state. Many were not looking for a liberal electoral democracy. Many were actually proposing either a system that was not the nation state, federal states, peasants' federations, regional associations, etc., or more radical forms of democracy, not liberal electoral democracy, not representation per se, but more either localized democratic structures, panchayats, etc. And all of them came with their problems. So this is not to say that there was that that the liberal democratic structure is the most flawed or that all of the others had no problems, but just to recognize that anti-colonial thought was broader, and actually there were many options that were discussed, and the fact that we ended up with some versions of nation state being the way that decolonization happened is a problematic. So to equate anti-colonialism with nationalism is a problematic move, and it's a move that I've questioned elsewhere in other writings as well. But I think that, engaging with Maududi as an anti-colonial thinker allows us to open up anti-colonial thought in this way as well. I hope that addresses some. Oh, and sorry, is that, you had a second question, and the second question was that does he only take the structure of the Leninist party, or does he actually take something substantive in terms of leftist ideas? It's a tricky question. It's a very good question, but it is also a tricky question because at different stages, we can see that Maududi does take some ideas, but he's also really concerned. He has his own framework. And as I said in the beginning, the framework does not privilege equality. Equality is not central for him. Harmony is central. There are other kind of social harmony, social equity, maybe justice might be, but not equality. And so what this means is that, for instance, he's influenced by debates in the 1960s, where if you, as you know from I was about to say if you remember, but I don't remember and you can't remember. I mean, neither of us was alive then. But in the 1960s, the influence of Maoist mobilizations in South Asia, the importance of, say, Maulana Bhashani, who also was very influential in West Pakistan. He was influential, of course, in Bangladesh, but and others like him. The question of land distribution had become really important, and Bhutto, in fact, came to power partly not because Bhutto himself promised land redistribution, but in fact, there were many other mobilizations in the late 1960s who had promised or who had raised the question of land distribution or redistribution on more equitable terms. And Maududi had to respond to some of that pressure. So even though Maududi had initially contested land reform, saying it's not Islamic, that Islam allows for property and Islam allows for unequal property. Islam doesn't allow for injustice, he made the argument, but not for making sure that everybody has the same and equal property per se. But he then revised his position. He wrote closer to the elections in 1970. He made an argument that the ceiling with which we can work in Pakistan has to be lower, right? So initially there was a debate about how much land can anybody own, and what is that ceiling? Uh, Sorry, yes, there was some disturbance with sound in the background. So all of this to say that he had taken some ideas on board. I think there was also a general kind of thrust thrust to Maududi's kind of conception of how does one approach society, etc. So there are ways in which various kinds of leftist ideas do make their way into Maududi's thought, but they are always tempered, I think, with his primary overriding interest, which is not in equality per se. Ultimately, he doesn't privilege equality. He privileges justice and he privileges harmony. Those are more important ends in a sense for him. Thank you.
Abdur Rahman Bari has written a question. From your speech, I'm curious about Maududi's critique of Hegel's conception of history. Once Alexander Kozev said to Carl Schmitt that Hegel is correct about history and Napoleon. In Reason and Revolution, HM examined that fascists are anti-Hegelian. Liberal left frame Maududi as Islamist fascist. That's the reason I want to know Maududi's criticism on Hegel's conception of history. Is Maududi frame history as progress or not?
There's much in this question it's an interesting question, and there's much that one can open up to think about, including the different ways in which Hegel's conception of history has been both understood and critiqued. But in general, we do tend to associate Hegel with a historicist vision, and by which we mean the idea that we can pick up any various entities seem to kind of live as or have a life as that entity across time, and that time moves in a linear direction, right? So if we think about, say, the idea of a nation or a people, that those people always have that a nation always has that particular shape, and that more the English were a nation in 900 AD, they were a nation in 1300 BC, they're a nation in 2000 2000 BCE, etc. So this idea that there always this thing stays the same and that history moves in a particular direction, those are two important ideas about history that we associate with Hegel. And now, whether Maududi has exactly the same idea, it's an interesting question to think about, because in some ways, Maududi, or in the wider Islamic tradition, there is a conception of history which is not historicist. There are different conceptions of history within the wider Islamic tradition as well, but one important conception which is not historicist is that history moves in a somewhat circular fashion, right? That nations rise and fall, individuals rise and fall, people rise and fall, countries rise and fall, and the cycle kind of continues over and over again. That is one important conception in Islamic historiography. So the ways in which histories have been written by Muslims, or the ways in which history has been understood. But there is also a conception of all human history in Abrahamic faiths, all human history moving towards the end time, in a sense, right? That we are all moving towards a judgment day. So the Islamic conception of history more broadly has these kind of built-in tensions. So that is one part of, I guess, the question that you've asked, which I will ask you to kind of park just that little bit about Hegel, his historicist vision, and the complexity of Islamic history on the one hand. But your question that you're asking at the end of this paragraph is really about Maududi and his vision, whether there is a vision of progress for Maududi or not. And it is an interesting question to ask because Maududi doesn't privilege progress, right? He's actually questioning often in his writing, he questions the kind of progress that others around him, those who are sold onto Enlightenment ideas, are proposing. And yet, of course, he talks about revolution, inqilab, he talks about a fundamental transformation that will lead us towards a better future. So there is a particular vision of moving forward that is also part of his thinking. Maududi is very much invested. He's not rejecting modernity. He's very much interested in Muslims understanding what modernity entails, understanding that the state is now a rival to Deen, and that Muslims have to figure out how to manage the state or what to do with the state. It is no longer useful, he says, for to be like the ulama who are really caught up in whether your pajama is should be half an inch higher or lower. He's saying that what Dean requires of us right now is political engagement. So he is invested in a certain kind of transformation. And then when you become invested in that transformation, it does allow him to kind of think about the future as something that will be different, potentially better. But he is not, I would say, on the whole, he is not historicist in the way, or he's not a strong Hegelian or a very committed Hegelian, also because he's not an explicitly self-ascribed Hegelian. But he's not really convinced that unless certain interventions are made, that history will always have a linear trajectory. He doesn't seem to be committed to that. But it's a complicated question to think about because progress, as we know in the European context and for European political theory, certainly for that important strand of critical theory, which is the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, progress is two things. Progress is both a political project. Progress is something we want, but progress is also a historical, or in a sense, it's a kind of based on a certain historical experience that what happened in Europe is considered progress, right? So progress has a very particular shape, and it is a project for everybody else to follow. And Maududi is not a progressive in that sense, right? So the distinction that I'm drawing here is that he's not invested in progressive politics of the kind that certain leftists and others were invested in. He certainly is worried about that vision of progress precisely because he's also not buying into the historical models that inform that vision of progress. But he is invested in kind of thinking about transformations over history as something that should drive human action as well. So I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but that was a very interesting question for me to think about.
Right now, I'm giving floor to Toha Salim. Toha Salim,
Yeah.
please.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I have like two questions.
Mm-hmm.
One is you chose this word, what is it called? This conservative anti-colonialism or
Mm-hmm.
anti-colonialist. So I was wondering, there are actually different kind of labels that people use for this kind of thinkers. It can be like Muslim modernist, it can be Muslim reformist or pan-Islamist or
Mm-hmm.
Islamist per se.
আমি
Uh,
রিটার্ন
I'm a
ওনার
bit
কথা বলি বুঝলেন ওই যে
kind of suspicious about the use of the term conservatism because people sometimes put this into a block which is against
Mm-hmm.
any kind of liberal sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, as I think one of the question Abdurrahman Bari he posed it, people try to frame it under Islamofascism.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this possibility by putting it under conservatism that people may label it under Islamofascism as well in that broad category. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you see the of other terms and naming in that
Mm-hmm.
context? And the second
Yeah.
thing,
Mm-hmm.
it caught my attention when you use the word organic whole.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of late 19th and early 20th century thinkers were kind of envisioning a society we would have like a perfect ideal society
Mm-hmm.
in all kinds of a spectrum. It can be leftist, it can be conservative, Islamist, whatsoever. But so nowadays there is this tendency and discussion and debates in especially in the Bangladeshi context that any form of Islamic aspiration is by definition utopian. And I like the coin of Andrew March, he coined an interesting word, realistic utopia for Sayyid Qutb.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how do you analyze this debate and kind of what's your perspective on the angle that whether you really see any kind of Islamic aspiration as a kind of utopia or this utopia that we saw in the early 20th century was a kind of remnants that we had from 19th century in general a broader tendency to have a very utopian idealistic organic society. uh, I am on the side of seeing it more as a kind of something realistic utopia, not necessarily something
Mm-hmm.
that we should take literally as it is. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
these two questions.
Thank you very much. I know that, the question of actually calling somebody conservative is seen as a negative for in some context, right? So it seems as if they are against change, they are holding on to something that needs change and they're not willing to change that, etc., etc. And actually, one of the things that I think is important to think about is that we actually don't have a very good definition of conservatism. And it is more in kind of scholarly debates. Often in political debates, people tend to kind of attribute these very quickly. But if you really open it up, it goes back to the French Revolution. There's a particular idea of those who want change and those who don't want change. But in fact, when we look at who has been called conservative, often those are people who have actually advocated very dramatic changes, right? So I'm sitting here in the UK. Here, Thatcher was a leader of what was called the Conservative, still called the Conservative Party, right? The Conservative Party fundamentally transformed the economy of post-war Britain. So the kind of social welfare state that had been set up after the Second World War was completely taken apart by Thatcher in the 1980s. Uh, so it is not that conservatives are not advocating change. We also then, Richard Burke, who has looked at conservatism in history of political thought, has a really useful article helping us think about the ways in which conservatism has been described, and different thinkers and different actors can be both called conservative and radical. So what exactly do these terms mean at any given point are also really important to think about. So I appreciate, the sensibility in Bangladesh right now where there is a certain renewed political attention on the place of Islam and Islamic thinkers and Islamist thinkers, the place of the relationship with Maududi as well as Jamaat-e-Islami in particular. But I think uh, it is also useful for us to think about in a bit more depth about what labels do we want for ourselves to think about and think with. So when I call Maududi a conservative anti-colonial thinker, I am doing that by actually really thinking through what conservative means. And so in the article that I've mentioned, I've actually looked at some detail into how can we and why should we call him a conservative anti-colonial thinker. He is different from other anti-colonial thinkers who have really appropriated, really kind of bought into, but also have, in our various vernacular traditions, also supported different visions of equality. And there is a group of anti colonial thinkers who are ultimately and primarily their opposition to colonialism is predicated on the question of equality. It is clear that for Maududi, this is not predicated on the question of equality. So, to be true to what Maududi is arguing for, we can work closely with what he's saying. Now, the question arises, so he is committed to social harmony. He is committed to equity, not equality. So, for instance, in the book Parda, he makes a very strong argument for saying that what is being sold as equality for women is actually their commodification, commercialization. This is a whole process in which a civilizational transformation is being kind of sneaked into the Indian context and into the Muslim context. All of this, he says, is in the name of equality, but this is not equality. Or at least he says, if equality means being the same as men, then that is not equality. And yet he also makes the argument that, spiritually women are equal, spirit, and in terms of their intellect, they may be, they have, he doesn't want to say exactly equal, but he says, in terms of their intellect, they have much to offer, but that they have different spheres of life, right? So this is his argument. So he is explicitly against at least that version of equality that many of the progressives of that time were proposing. So if we work with that, we see that what he's ultimately really philosophically committed to is the idea of society as an organic whole in which each one of us has different roles to play. What is important is that each one of us deals with equity and justice with the other people that we want to engage with, right? So that is a particular vision of society. To me, it's a better definition of conservatism because it allows us to think about the fact that conservatives will want changes. Maududi wanted changes, but he's also that change is to be brought about for a particular purpose, and that purpose is not equality, it is social harmony. You may want to read him as a progressive. That is your prerogative, right? I am only making the argument that we have to stay true or at least close to the ideas that were proposed. We may want to read other things, but it doesn't seem to me that Maududi allows for a very strong advocacy of equality in his ideas. And it raises important questions for us to think about, right? So all of his ideas and questions are really important. The question about whether we want equality in all spheres of life, whether we can even manage equality in all spheres of life is an important one, right? It may be that you and I will have different answers to that question. So that is one part of my answer to what you're raising. Now, you've also raised a concern about what others will say when we call somebody a conservative anti-colonial and whether they will go on to call him a proto-fascist or a fascist, etc. I think that what others will call anybody is open to debate, and in itself that should not deter us from first understanding for ourselves what are the categories we are using and why we are using them. What do they mean for us? So, in the first instance, we need to understand for ourselves. And in the second instance, once we understand ourselves, it is possible to engage with others to open up that category, right? To say, okay, conservative is not the same as fascist. Conservative is not the same as terrorist, but conservative is something that I am defining as this, and it is important because if you choose to, that these are the principles on the basis of which you make the argument that this is why conservatism is important, or is something that we have always had, or is something that I want to support, however you want to do this. Now, if you're committed to placing yourself as a progressive and you want to read Maududi as a progressive as well, that is entirely up to you. I can't stop you, right? I'm only giving you my reading to say this is how I understand Maududi. This is how I've actually spent a lot of time to try and think about what exactly does conservative mean. Conservative is not somebody who's against change. Conservative is not somebody who is a fascist. Conservative is not somebody who is against, a just society, etc. But it is a very particular vision that does not privilege equality. And that is a very important role in contemporary politics, where the liberal framework privileges equality, may not deliver it, right? We know that the liberal framework doesn't necessarily deliver equality, but it presents equality as a central framework. In fact, in liberal thought, there is a real tension between freedom and equality. So there's a version of liberal thought that is much more invested in freedom, and we often call them classical liberals or libertarians. And then there's a version of liberalism that is more invested in equality, and that is the more left-leaning version of liberalism. But there is a tension within contemporary liberal thought as well, and democratic polities as well. So all of this to say that I sympathize with some of the concerns, or I understand some of the kind of granular concerns that maybe drive your question, but it is important, I think, that we first pause to think through the categories that we can work with, and within given somebody's ideas, given the range of what they have written, etc. I am not. So Andrew March talks about Sayyid Qutb as presenting what he says is a realistic utopia, right? And I am actually not convinced very much by that. I mean, I think March is right to note that within the wider Islamic tradition, which this is the argument that I see him making, that within the wider Islamic tradition, there is an emphasis on the Quran tells us, we have various hadiths that tell us that Islam has been made easy for human beings, that Islam requires of human beings that which they can already provide given their fitrat, given their capacities, that each human being can only do what they can do. And so Islam has been made easy for human beings. Andrew takes that, and because this also plays a role in Sayyid Qutb's thought, he takes that and he kind of explicates that it's a kind of a translation of an important aspect of Islamic thought. I'm not sure if he's making an argument to say that this is a realistic utopia. He's only saying this is how Sayyid Qutb and others have made this argument. I am not convinced that Islamic thought and Islamists are best read through the framework of utopia. I think this is a problematic way of approaching Islamic ideas, because they are always presented as if, these are unrealistic ideas, they can't work in this world. So they are always about some utopian framework. Whereas, those, for instance, liberal theorists who go back to the Greek state and who take inspiration from the Greek state, that is considered to be okay and non-utopian. Um, and I think if people go back into history and look for inspiration into history, that has been done over time. And we can continue to do that. It doesn't make human endeavors utopian if they are looking back to history to find inspiration for contemporary political concerns. So I'm a bit skeptical about that kind of framing of Islamic thought in general.
Just to make it clear, those are actually not my questions. Those are the questions that exist in people's minds. So I was just actually
Yes.
playing devil's advocate here.
No,
And I
no,
agree
no.
with you. I agree with you.
I understand. These are important questions to think through.
I mean, we also want anyone have to play devil's advocate. Whatever. Thank you very much for your question. Right now, we will go to the last question of this
Mhm.
session. Faisal Iqbal. Assalamu alaikum, Professor Humeira Iqtidar. Thank you for the insightful session. I have a question regarding the concept of equality from different categories like gender, humanistics, his theo, democracy, etc. How was Maulana Maududi approached it?
Yeah, thank you. This is a good question for us to think about. I think in general, Maududi is actually, in some instances, advocating equality. But when I say that he doesn't privilege equality, it means that this is not the principle that drives all of his projects, right? So he's interested in equality in some instances. For instance, in his kind of critique of anti-colonialism, one of the things that he is concerned about is that certain ways of being, certain ways of thinking become hegemonic. They push out other ways of being and thinking. But it's actually not really primarily on the question of equality. So there are other anti-colonial thinkers who are saying, you know, if you have a commitment to equality, if liberal thought is all about equality or about freedom, then how can you not give us equality and freedom, right? So there are some anti-colonial thinkers and activists who are making that argument. Maududi is not making that argument. Maududi's concern is that certain ways of life, certain ways of being will be pushed out, will be eradicated, and he is concerned with conserving, with keeping those ways of life and being operational or still there. He also thinks that, you know, Islam provides a superior option. So he makes the argument in several instances that, you know, for instance, in Al Jihad fil Islam as well, he's making the argument that actually in his comparison, which is a rich comparison across empires, across different religious traditions, etc. But ultimately his answer is that Islam provides a superior answer, right? So he's quite committed to establishing that there is a better answer from within the Islamic tradition. He's quite committed to what he sees as the value of Islamic civilization, etc. So he's not making the argument for anti-colonialism on the question of equality. He's not making the argument for you know, the kind of gender separation that he advocates in Parda. He's very clearly not supportive, or equality is not an important concept for him over there. But equality does have a role to play in his vision of theodemocracy. He does think that there should be, you know, what the advantage of democracy is, that it allows all individuals, particularly men, but all individuals, to take part in decision making that affects their lives. His only concern about democracy as it is practiced in Europe and America at the time that he's writing, in the 30s in particular, is that democracy tends to produce what were then called permanent majorities and permanent minorities. And so he wants to give an ethical framework within which democracy can be practiced. And that ethical framework he draws from Sharia. So he's interested in equality in some instances, he's not interested in it other instances. And so in general, it is not the overarching principle that drives his thinking, that drives his ideas and his practice. This is not to say he's against equality. It's not that he's proposing inequality. It is just that equality is not the central concern for him, right? And I think we are really, especially in political debates, we tend to be really invested in these oppositions. And so as soon as we say that equality is not central to him, then we are worried that that person will then be seen as being committed to inequality. He's not committed to inequality. He just thinks that what is more important for a society is social harmony, is kind of justice and equity within a framework, wider framework of harmony, not equality. That is my reading, and I am very happy to have other readings discussed, or other ways of thinking about Maududi also brought about and discussed. But thank you very much. This has been very interesting for me as well, and I very much appreciate your questions and comments. I do have a hard deadline for ending this, but thank you very much for this invitation.
Thank you, Professor Iqtidar, for sharing your insights and helping us engage with these important intellectual debates with greater depth and nuance. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope this conversation inspires further reading, reflection, and discussion. Have a wonderful evening. Assalamu alaikum
Thank
and
you.
good night. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.